People often think miracles arrive with trumpets and flashing lights, but sometimes they begin with a dog refusing to walk away from something everyone else stopped noticing years ago. The rain had been falling across the Idaho countryside since just after noon, turning the gravel roads into ribbons of mud and covering the rolling fields in a silver haze that blurred the distant tree lines. Wyatt Mercer eased his aging pickup truck along the narrow county road with both hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape beyond the windshield. At 41 years old, he had learned to appreciate routines that asked very little from him. Repairing tractors and farm equipment in neighboring towns kept enough money in his pocket to pay the bills. Returning each evening to the small cabin outside Ashton gave him the silence he had grown used to after leaving the Army years before. He no longer searched for excitement. Peace, however imperfect, was enough. Beside him sat Duke, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose silver-black coat had begun to darken with rainwater from their earlier stop at a feed store. The dog usually rested quietly during drives, occasionally lifting his head whenever deer appeared near the roadside or when children waved from passing vehicles. But this afternoon felt different. Duke's ears suddenly stood upright, his amber eyes fixed on something outside the passenger window. Before Wyatt could react, the German shepherd released a low whine unlike anything he had heard from him before. It was not fear. It was insistence. Wyatt slowed the truck. "What is it, buddy?" he asked softly. Duke shifted in his seat, nose pressed against the glass as they rolled past an overgrown field dotted with rusted irrigation pipes and waist-high weeds bending beneath the rain. Then Wyatt saw it. Nearly hidden beyond a stand of cottonwoods sat an old delivery truck, its faded paint almost consumed by years of weather and neglect. One tire had collapsed into the earth. Vines crawled up its sides. Rust streaked the panels like old tears. It looked as though the world had forgotten it entirely. Wyatt would have driven past without another thought. Instead, Duke barked once. Sharp, certain. The German shepherd began pawing gently at the passenger door. "You cannot be serious," Wyatt muttered, pulling the pickup onto the muddy shoulder. Rain drummed steadily against the roof as he stepped outside, tugging the collar of his canvas jacket higher against the cold wind. Duke jumped down beside him and immediately headed toward the abandoned truck. There was no hesitation in the dog's movements. His paws splashed through puddles while his gaze remained fixed ahead, as though following directions only he could hear. Wyatt trudged after him through wet grass until they reached the vehicle. Up close, the truck seemed even older. The windshield was clouded with grime. One headlight hung crooked from its socket. The smell of damp metal and earth lingered in the air. Duke stopped beside the rusted back doors and sat down. He did not scratch. He did not bark again. He simply waited. Rainwater dripped from the dog's fur, while his amber eyes lifted toward Wyatt with quiet expectation. "You really want me to open this thing?" Wyatt asked. Duke remained perfectly still. The old hinges protested beneath Wyatt's grip as he reached for the handle. Rust flaked beneath his fingers. The wind swept across the empty field. Then, as the heavy doors finally creaked apart after years of silence, a tiny wind chime hanging somewhere inside answered with a soft, delicate melody that seemed impossibly out of place in the forgotten darkness beyond. The delicate chime faded into the steady rhythm of rain striking the truck's rusted roof, leaving behind a silence so complete that Wyatt became aware of every small sound surrounding him. Water dripped from the brim of his cap. Wind moved through the tall grass in restless waves. Duke's breathing remained slow and steady beside him as the German shepherd stared into the dim interior with unwavering focus. Wyatt hesitated beneath the open doors, allowing his eyes to adjust to the gray afternoon light filtering through cracked seams in the metal walls. The smell that drifted outward surprised him. He had expected mildew, decay, or the sharp bite of abandoned machinery left too long beneath the elements. Instead, there lingered traces of cedar, old leather, and the faint sweetness of lavender tucked somewhere deep within the forgotten space. It smelled less like neglect and more like memory. He stepped carefully onto the truck's worn metal floor. The interior had not been stripped or vandalized. In fact, everything appeared strangely untouched, as though someone had arranged each item with intention before quietly stepping away. Folded neatly against one wall rested a small quilt patterned with faded blue stars. Nearby sat a weathered metal lunchbox decorated with peeling images of farm animals. A pair of children's rain boots, no larger than Wyatt's hand, stood side by side beneath a wooden crate as if waiting for someone to return and slip them on. Duke climbed into the truck without hesitation, moving slowly among the scattered belongings with remarkable gentleness. He lowered his nose toward the quilt before continuing onward, careful not to disturb anything. Wyatt knelt beside the lunchbox and ran his fingers over the chipped paint. Years of repairing equipment had taught him to recognize signs of chaos left behind by accidents or haste. This was neither. There were no overturned containers, no broken locks, no evidence of fear. The scene carried the quiet order of a family preparing for an ordinary day that somehow never unfolded as planned. On a narrow shelf mounted near the front of the cargo space sat several framed photographs secured upright against the wall. Wyatt lifted one carefully. The image showed a smiling couple standing beneath a cottonwood tree, their arms wrapped around two young children whose grins reflected uncomplicated joy. The edges of the photograph had yellowed with time, but the warmth captured within it remained untouched. Another picture revealed a man beside an older pickup truck, his baseball cap tilted backward as he held a toddler against his shoulder. The resemblance between the truck in the photograph and the one surrounding Wyatt sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the rain. Duke stopped near the far corner and sat down once more. His amber eyes settled upon a worn leather journal resting atop a neatly folded blanket. He looked toward Wyatt, then back at the journal, patient but insistent. Wyatt reached for it slowly. The leather cover had softened through years of use, its edges frayed from countless hands turning its pages. He opened it expecting maintenance records or grocery lists. Instead, tucked inside the front cover was a pressed wildflower and a handwritten note in careful script. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear enough to read. If you found this, please know these things mattered to someone. Wyatt stared at the sentence while rain whispered across the fields outside, and the tiny wind chime shifted once more somewhere above him. Duke remained beside the journal without moving, his quiet presence offering no explanation, only the undeniable feeling that the abandoned truck had never been forgotten at all. It had simply been waiting for someone willing to notice what everyone else had overlooked. Wyatt remained kneeling inside the forgotten cargo space long after the rain had softened from a steady downpour into a gentle whisper against the rusted roof above him. The worn leather journal rested in his hands, its pages carrying the faint scent of cedar and dust, while Duke sat nearby with the quiet patience that had defined nearly every chapter of the German shepherd's life. Outside, gray clouds hung low over the Idaho fields, wrapping the countryside in muted shades of silver and green. Inside the truck, time seemed to move differently. Wyatt carefully turned the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, written by someone who believed ordinary moments deserved to be remembered. The earliest entries spoke of weather forecasts, grocery lists, and reminders to pick up feed from the local supply store. There were notes about school concerts, fishing trips planned for summer weekends, and comments about how quickly children seemed to outgrow their favorite boots. Wyatt found himself slowing down, reading details that should have belonged to strangers, yet somehow felt deeply familiar. He paused beside an entry that simply read, "Emma lost her first tooth today and insisted the tooth fairy should pay extra because she had to be brave." Another page described a family picnic near the river, complete with complaints about burned hot dogs and laughter over an overturned lemonade pitcher. None of it was extraordinary. That was exactly what made it powerful. These pages captured a life measured not by grand achievements, but by small moments people assumed they would always have more time to enjoy. Wyatt lowered the journal into his lap and stared through the open truck doors toward the rain-soaked fields beyond. He understood more than he wished he did. Since returning home from the army, his own days had narrowed into routines built for survival rather than joy. Wake before sunrise. Repair machinery. Return to the cabin. Heat canned soup. Sleep. Repeat. The coffee mug left drying beside the sink each night had become less a comfort and more a marker of another day successfully endured. He had stopped expecting surprises. He had stopped planning far ahead. Sometimes he wondered whether he had mistaken existing for living. Duke rose from his place beside the folded blankets and crossed the narrow space separating them. The German Shepherd rested his head gently against Wyatt's shoulder. His damp fur carried the clean scent of rain and earth. Wyatt scratched behind the dog's ears without lifting his gaze from the open journal. "You know," he said quietly, his voice nearly swallowed by the sound of rainfall, "you are probably the only reason I still get out of bed some mornings." Duke responded with a slow exhale and leaned a little closer. There was no judgment in the dog's steady presence. No expectation that Wyatt explained the years lost to loneliness or the invisible weight he still carried beneath calm expressions and practiced routines. The journal slipped open again beneath Wyatt's hand. Near the bottom of the next page, written in the same careful script, another sentence waited for him. "The hardest part about losing your way is convincing yourself there is no road back." Wyatt read the words twice before closing his eyes. Somewhere above them, the tiny wind chimes stirred softly with the movement of air through the cracked truck doors. Duke lifted his head and looked toward the front of the cargo space, his ears rising once more. Wyatt followed the dog's gaze, unaware that the abandoned truck had not finished revealing its purpose. Some discoveries begin by answering questions. Others begin by reminding us of the parts of ourselves we thought had quietly disappeared forever. The journal remained open across Wyatt's knees as the rain gradually eased into a fine mist that blurred the Idaho fields beyond the truck, turning the late afternoon into something soft and dreamlike. Duke had not moved from his position near the front of the cargo space, his ears standing alert as he stared toward a section of the truck Wyatt had barely noticed before. The German Shepherd's posture carried none of the tension associated with danger. Instead, there was expectation in the way he waited, as though urging Wyatt to continue listening to a story interrupted by time. Wyatt slipped the journal into the inner pocket of his canvas jacket and followed Duke's gaze. Mounted beside the front wall of the cargo area was a narrow wooden organizer containing yellowed envelopes secured with twine. Most had never been opened. Beneath them rested a folded road map with circles drawn around towns scattered throughout eastern Idaho. Tucked into the corner of the organizer was a small address book, its leather cover cracked with age. Wyatt picked it up carefully and turned through pages filled with names written in fading blue ink. Some entries had been crossed out. Others contained handwritten notes beside them. When he reached the letter M, one address had been underlined twice. Margaret Hale, Ashton, Idaho. The same town Wyatt passed through nearly every week on his way to repair combines and irrigation systems. His eyes narrowed as he studied the note written beneath her name. "Please tell her I tried to keep my promise." The sentence settled heavily against his chest. Outside, the wind shifted through the wet grass while droplets slid from the cottonwood leaves overhead. Duke approached slowly and lowered his head beneath Wyatt's hand, accepting the familiar touch behind his ears before glancing toward the address book again. "You really do not plan on letting this go, do you?" Wyatt asked quietly. Duke blinked once and rested beside him. Wyatt exhaled through his nose and leaned back against the cold metal wall. The name Margaret Hale stirred no recognition, yet something in the careful handwriting unsettled him. Promises mattered differently to people who had spent years relying on them. In the Army, promises meant someone returned for you. They meant someone watched your back. They meant tomorrow existed beyond today's uncertainty. He thought about the second coffee mug collecting dust inside his cabin, untouched for years. He thought about how often he had declined invitations from neighbors because solitude required less courage than connection. Somewhere along the way, surviving had become enough. Yet the ordinary objects surrounding him challenged that belief. Children's boots, family photographs, pressed flowers, unopened letters. They spoke of people who had planned birthdays, packed lunches, and expected another sunrise together. They had believed there would be time to fulfill every intention left unfinished. Wyatt folded the address book closed and looked toward the misty fields outside the truck. Ashton was less than 20 miles away. A short drive. An answer to a question that refused to loosen its grip on him. Duke rose immediately, tail giving a slow sweep against the metal floor before he stepped toward the open doors. Wyatt almost laughed despite the ache rising unexpectedly behind his ribs. "I guess we are doing this," he said. The German Shepherd paused at the threshold and looked back with quiet certainty shining in his amber eyes. As Wyatt followed him out into the cool evening air carrying the scent of wet earth and distant pine, He realized that sometimes healing begins not with finding what was lost, but with choosing to carry someone else's unfinished hope a little farther down the road. The rain had stopped completely by the time Wyatt guided his pickup truck into Ashton, leaving the small Idaho town washed clean beneath the fading light of early evening. Water still clung to the sidewalks and storefront windows, reflecting the glow of antique street lamps that flickered, awake one by one as the sky softened into shades of lavender and pale gold. Duke sat quietly in the passenger seat, his amber eyes watching the passing scenery with calm attentiveness, while the address book rested on the dashboard between them. Wyatt followed the handwritten directions through familiar streets he had driven countless times without ever noticing the modest white house tucked near the edge of town. A narrow front porch overlooked a carefully tended garden, now sleeping beneath the damp chill of late autumn. Wind chimes made from old silverware stirred gently beneath the eaves, their delicate music carrying across the stillness of the neighborhood. Wyatt parked at the curb and remained seated for a moment, his fingers resting against the worn steering wheel. He had repaired engines, rebuilt transmissions, and solved mechanical problems most people considered impossible. Conversations like this had always been harder. Duke nudged Wyatt's elbow with quiet encouragement before stepping out onto the wet pavement. The German shepherd waited beside the gate leading toward the front porch as though reminding him that turning away now would leave another promise unfinished. Wyatt climbed the porch steps and knocked softly against the weathered blue door. For several long moments, nothing happened. Then slow footsteps approached from inside. The door opened to reveal an elderly woman wrapped in a cream-colored cardigan, silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and pale green eyes softened by decades of kindness and loss. Her gaze moved first to Wyatt before settling on Duke, standing patiently beside him. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly, his posture gentle and respectful. "Can I help you?" she asked in a voice as delicate as pressed flowers tucked between book pages. Wyatt removed his cap and shifted awkwardly beneath her steady gaze. "Ma'am, I think I found something that belongs to you," he said quietly. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the weathered address book. The moment Margaret Hale saw it, the color drained from her expression. Her trembling fingers lifted toward her mouth as tears gathered instantly in her eyes. "Oh," she whispered, the single word carrying 40 years of unanswered questions. She reached carefully for the address book and held it against her chest as though afraid it might disappear. "Where did you find this?" Wyatt explained about the abandoned truck resting beyond the cottonwood trees and the belongings preserved within its rusted walls. Margaret listened without interruption, though tears slipped silently down her cheeks. When he described the faded photographs and the children's rain boots tucked beneath the crate, she closed her eyes briefly before looking toward the framed family portraits lining the hallway behind her. "That truck belonged to my brother, Samuel," she said at last. "He was a veteran too." Her voice trembled but never broke. "He spent years helping people who had nowhere else to go, especially those who came home carrying burdens they did not know how to set down." Duke crossed the threshold only when Margaret bent carefully and extended her hand toward him. The German shepherd accepted her touch without hesitation, resting his head gently beneath her palm. Margaret smiled through her tears as she stroked the fur between his ears. "Samuel always said dogs understood things people missed," she murmured softly. Then she looked back at Wyatt, sorrow and hope intertwined in her expression. "There is something else you need to know," she said. "Before my brother disappeared, he made a promise he never stopped talking about. And I have been waiting 40 years for someone to tell me what became of it." Margaret Hale led Wyatt and Duke into a modest living room filled with the quiet evidence of a life shaped by patience and remembrance. The scent of chamomile tea drifted through the warm space, mingling with the faint fragrance of cinnamon and old books stacked neatly on polished wooden shelves. Framed photographs covered the mantel above the stone fireplace, each one preserving fragments of birthdays, graduations, fishing trips, and ordinary afternoons that had long since passed into memory. Rainwater still clung to Duke's coat as the German shepherd settled near the hearth, his amber eyes moving between Margaret and Wyatt with steady attentiveness. Margaret disappeared briefly into the kitchen before returning with a faded cardboard box held carefully in her trembling hands. She lowered herself into the armchair nearest the window and rested the box upon her lap. For several moments, She simply looked down at it, fingertips tracing worn edges softened by decades of handling. Samuel never stopped believing people deserved another chance, she said softly. Especially the men and women who came home carrying burdens too heavy to explain. She opened the box and removed a collection of letters secured with blue ribbon, newspaper clippings, sketches drawn on folded napkins, and handwritten notes outlining plans that had never become reality. Wyatt leaned forward as Margaret carefully unfolded one yellowed page after another. There were rough drawings of small cabins arranged around a communal garden, lists of supplies needed for repairs, names of local business owners who had promised donated materials, recipes intended for community meals, notes reminding Samuel to visit veterans living alone outside town. He wanted to create a place where no one would have to pretend they were fine when they were not, Margaret whispered. A place where people could heal without shame. Duke lifted his head when Margaret placed a final envelope onto the coffee table between them. Unlike the others, this one remained sealed. Samuel's handwriting stretched across the front in careful block letters. For whoever chooses to finish what I could not. Margaret looked toward Wyatt, her pale green eyes reflecting equal parts sorrow and hope. I could never bring myself to open it, she admitted. I kept believing Samuel would walk through that front door and explain everything himself. The room fell silent except for the gentle ticking of an antique clock mounted near the hallway. Wyatt stared at the envelope while memories surfaced uninvited. Long nights sitting alone in his cabin. The untouched second coffee mug collecting dust beside the sink. The conversations avoided because admitting loneliness felt too much like surrender. He thought of the veterans he had known who struggled quietly after returning home. Men who fixed fences, stocked shelves, or disappeared into routines because existing seemed easier than asking for help. Duke rose from his place by the fireplace and crossed the room. The German shepherd rested his head gently against Wyatt's knee, grounding him in the present with familiar warmth and unwavering loyalty. Wyatt reached down automatically, fingers threading through damp fur while his gaze returned to Samuel's final letter. Outside, twilight settled over Ashton, soft rain giving way to the hush that follows storms. Margaret folded her hands tightly together. Perhaps Samuel was waiting for the wrong person, she said quietly. Or perhaps he trusted that the right one would eventually arrive without realizing it. Duke looked up at Wyatt with calm certainty shining in his amber eyes. For the second time since discovering the abandoned truck hidden among the cottonwoods, Wyatt felt the unmistakable pull of a road he had never intended to travel. Some promises are inherited through blood. Others arrive through unexpected companions and ask only one question in return. Will you carry this hope farther than the person before you had the chance to go? The sealed envelope rested on Margaret Hale's coffee table beneath the soft glow of a brass reading lamp. Its cream-colored paper marked by decades of waiting and the careful handwriting of a man who had once believed there would always be enough tomorrows left to finish what mattered most. Outside, the rain had finally surrendered to the quiet hush of evening, leaving the neighborhood wrapped in cool autumn stillness. Duke remained beside Wyatt's chair, his silver-black coat dry now from the warmth of the fire, his amber eyes shifting occasionally between the elderly woman and the unopened letter as if he understood that some moments deserved reverence. Margaret folded her hands together in her lap and nodded slowly. I think Samuel wanted someone else to read it, she whispered. Wyatt hesitated before reaching for the envelope. His calloused fingers traced the edges softened by time. He had repaired broken machinery his entire adult life, restoring usefulness to things other people had discarded without a second thought. Yet nothing had prepared him for the weight of unfolding another person's unfinished dream. The paper crackled softly as he opened it. Samuel's handwriting filled the page in neat, steady lines. If you are reading this, then life did not unfold the way I hoped. But if there is one thing service taught me, it is that hope does not disappear simply because one person can no longer carry it. Wyatt continued reading as the room fell silent around him. Samuel wrote of veterans he had met sleeping in their trucks behind grocery stores, men who returned from war carrying invisible burdens that did not fit neatly into conversations over coffee. He described widows who quietly shared casseroles with neighbors struggling to make rent and farmers who donated produce to families too proud to ask for help. The world, Samuel believed, still contained more kindness than people gave it credit for. It simply needed places where that kindness could gather. Attached to the letter was a folded property map marked with red circles and handwritten notes. A small parcel of family land outside Ashton had been set aside decades earlier. Samuel had intended to transform it into a refuge where veterans could find temporary housing, practical support, and the dignity of belonging without judgment. There were plans for workshops where skills could be shared, gardens cultivated together, and meals served around long tables where silence would never be mistaken for weakness. The dream had never been about charity. It had always been about community. Wyatt lowered the letter slowly and stared at the map resting across his knees. He thought about the quiet rhythm of his own life, measured by repair orders and solitary evenings in a cabin tucked beyond the pines. He thought about how easy it had become to mistake isolation for peace simply because loneliness asked less of him than connection ever could. Duke rose from his place beside the fireplace and crossed the room without hesitation. The German shepherd rested his head gently against Wyatt's hand, his familiar warmth anchoring him to the present. Margaret's eyes glistened as she looked toward the property map. "The land still belongs to our family," she said softly. "I kept paying the taxes because I could never bring myself to let the dream go." Her voice trembled with fragile hope. But dreams need living hands. Wyatt looked down at Samuel's final words written near the bottom of the letter. "You do not have to save the world. Just leave it kinder than you found it." Beyond the living room windows, stars began appearing one by one above the Idaho sky, while Duke remained beside him with unwavering devotion. For the first time in years, Wyatt understood that the question before him had nothing to do with whether he was capable. The real question was whether he was finally ready to stop surviving and begin belonging to something larger than himself. Morning sunlight spilled across the Idaho Valley in long ribbons of gold, illuminating fields still damp from the previous day's rain and casting a gentle glow over the parcel of land marked on Samuel Hale's weathered map. Wyatt stood near the rusted gate at the edge of the property, his work boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, while Duke moved quietly through the tall grass beside him. The German shepherd's silver-black coat caught the morning light as he explored the perimeter with calm confidence, occasionally pausing to glance back at Wyatt, as if reminding him that some journeys only reveal their purpose one step at a time. The land itself was unremarkable by most standards. A weathered barn leaned slightly beneath decades of Idaho winters. A modest farmhouse sat empty beneath towering cottonwoods whose leaves whispered softly in the breeze. Wildflowers pushed through patches of neglected soil. Yet standing there with Samuel's folded map in one hand, Wyatt could almost see what had once existed in another man's imagination. A communal garden thriving beneath summer skies. Workshops echoing with laughter and the steady rhythm of shared labor. Veterans gathered around picnic tables exchanging stories they had carried in silence for too long. Margaret stood nearby wrapped in a knitted shawl despite the warming day, tears shining in her pale green eyes as she watched Duke trot through the field where Samuel had once envisioned hope taking root. "He talked about this place all the time," she said softly. "He believed healing happened when people felt useful again." Wyatt studied the farmhouse and felt something unfamiliar settle inside him. For years, he had measured his life through obligations small enough to manage alone. Repair this engine. Replace that transmission. Pay the electric bill. Feed Duke. Sleep. Repeat. The future had become something observed from a distance rather than actively built. Yet standing upon land preserved through another family's faith, he realized how often fear disguised itself as practicality. Duke barked once and bounded toward the old barn. Wyatt followed, finding the German shepherd waiting beside a faded wooden workbench tucked beneath the open doorway. Carved into the weathered surface were initials, measurements, and a sentence nearly erased by time. "Leave room for one more chair." Wyatt brushed dust from the words and closed his eyes briefly. He remembered soldiers sharing coffee before sunrise, mechanics staying late to help someone finish repairs, neighbors arriving unasked with casseroles after funerals. The strongest communities he had ever known had all followed the same simple rule. Leave room for one more chair. News of Samuel's dream spread more quickly than Wyatt expected. The local hardware store owner donated paint. A retired carpenter offered spare lumber stacked behind his garage. Teenagers from the high school volunteered weekends to clear weeds and repair fencing. Farmers arrived with extra seed packets tucked into jacket pockets. No one asked whether the effort would become famous. They only asked where to begin. Margaret watched from beneath the cottonwoods as laughter slowly returned to land that had waited decades for another chance. Duke moved among the volunteers with his familiar calm, accepting gentle pats behind the ears from strangers who somehow already felt like neighbors. As the afternoon sun drifted westward and the first fresh coat of paint transformed the farmhouse porch, Wyatt realized he could no longer remember the last time he had looked forward to tomorrow. Sometimes miracles arrive as dramatic rescues. Other times they appear as borrowed tools, shared meals, muddy boots, and ordinary people deciding together that another person's unfinished hope is worth carrying forward. Spring arrived gradually across the Idaho Valley, replacing frost with wildflowers and coaxing fresh green from the cottonwoods that stood watch over the property Samuel Hale had once imagined transforming into a refuge of belonging. Months had passed since Wyatt first opened the rusted truck doors in that rain-soaked field, and the land that had waited in silence for decades now carried the unmistakable rhythm of life returning. Fresh paint brightened the farmhouse porch. Vegetable gardens stretched across neat rows of dark soil. The weathered barn echoed with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and conversations once buried beneath years of solitude. Veterans gathered beneath shade trees, sharing stories at their own pace, some speaking easily, while others simply listened with grateful eyes. No one was expected to explain what could not be put into words. There was dignity in being present. Margaret Hale often sat beneath the cottonwoods wrapped in one of her knitted shawls, a cup of tea warming her hands while she watched Samuel's dream finally unfold before her. She smiled more often now. The sorrow she carried had not disappeared, but it no longer stood alone. Children from neighboring farms chased one another through open fields while volunteers prepared meals in the farmhouse kitchen, the scent of fresh bread and simmering soup drifting through open windows. Duke moved quietly among them all with the same calm devotion that had led Wyatt to an abandoned truck no one else had bothered to notice. The German shepherd greeted newcomers with gentle eyes and patient companionship, resting beside those who found comfort easier to accept from a loyal dog than another human being. One warm evening as the sun lowered behind distant hills, turning the sky shades of amber and rose, Wyatt stood on the farmhouse porch beside Duke and watched lanterns begin to glow across the property. He held a familiar metal coffee mug in one hand, while laughter drifted upward from picnic tables arranged beneath strings of lights. The second chair beside him was no longer empty. Sometimes Margaret joined him there. Other times a veteran who needed someone to listen accepted the invitation. Leave room for one more chair. The words carved into Samuel's workbench had become more than a philosophy. They had become the heartbeat of the place. Wyatt looked across the valley and struggled to recognize the man he had been only months earlier. The routines remained familiar. There were fences to repair, roofs to patch, engines to fix. Yet purpose had quietly changed everything. Surviving was no longer the finish line. He had discovered that healing often arrived through service, through showing up, through choosing community even when isolation felt safer. Duke rested against Wyatt's leg and lifted his gaze toward the horizon where evening settled gently over the mountains. Wyatt reached down automatically, fingers brushing through the German shepherd's fur while gratitude tightened unexpectedly in his chest. He never learned exactly why Duke had stopped beside that forgotten truck or what instinct had convinced him not to walk away. Perhaps some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Perhaps they existed simply to redirect weary souls toward the people and places waiting to welcome them home. As the first stars emerged above the Idaho sky and the sounds of shared meals and easy conversation carried through the spring air, Wyatt understood something he wished he had learned years earlier. The abandoned truck had never been the destination. It had only been the door. Beyond it waited unfinished promises, borrowed hope, and a reminder that kindness is rarely wasted. Sometimes the ones who rescue us arrive on 4 steady paws, sit patiently beside what the world has forgotten, and teach us that even after loss, there is still room at the table for a new beginning.